Hello and welcome back to the Snappiness YouTube channel. I'm glad you're here with me today. I hope you're doing well wherever you are in the world and that you're taking great photos and most of all that you're having fun with it. Today we're going to talk about something really exciting, and that is Pentax Astrotracer Type 3 on the Pentax K-3 III. All right, in this video, I want to cover everything from what is Astro Tracer, how does it work, and then what are the advantages and disadvantages, and then what could Pentax implement in the future. I got some ideas for them, so stick around for that. First off, before I start, I want to give a shout out to Kobe on his YouTube channel. He does a lot for the Pentax community, and I know that he's been itching to try out this feature and do a video on it. He always does great videos covering Pentax features. And he's just had cloudy skies. He hasn't been able to have clear night skies. So poor guy, he would have already done it if he could, but I'm sure that'll be coming soon, so you can watch his channel. Okay, let's dive into it. What is Astro Tracer? Astro Tracer is Pentax's name for a feature that they've had on their cameras for a while now that helps track celestial objects in the sky without producing star trails. So the first iteration of Astro Tracer was GPS Astro Tracer. Astro Tracer Type 3 is a new type of Astro Tracer released in the latest firmware update for the Pentax K-3 III, and unfortunately no other Pentax cameras at this time. So how does Astro Tracer Type 3 work? Astro Tracer Type 3 does not rely on GPS or any other sensors in the camera to determine where you're pointing in the night sky. What it does is it takes a series of images, preliminary images is what Rico Pentax calls them in their little manual, which we'll get to in a second. It takes some preliminary images and then based off of the movement of the stars, then calculates how it needs to move the sensor. I was pleasantly surprised that Astro Tracer Type 3 is very simple to use. I actually thought the GPS Astro Tracer was pretty simple to use, but it was a little complicated. You had to turn the GPS on and remember how to do that and then set it in the right mode. And then for every location where you're at, you really need to recalibrate it. So you kind of like move the camera like this and the little gyros in the camera are detecting things and the GPS is calibrating and then it says it's calibrated and sometimes it didn't calibrate and so you had to do that whole thing again. It's still awesome. I think it's an awesome feature, but this is even easier. So here's how you use it. So I'm going to be getting all these instructions directly from the little manual PDF that Pentax put out in the firmware update notes for the Pentax K-3 III. You can go there to get the same link, or I'll link it in the description as well. Okay, how to use Astro Tracer Type 3. First, it says to put the camera on a stable tripod. This should go without saying. Select Type 3 and Astro Tracer in shooting setting 4. That sounds like a bunch of gibberish, but basically it means you turn the camera on, go to your menu, go to the first section with the little camera icon, and then you can see the numbers next to it, the little ones. You're going to go to section 4, just scroll down to section 4, and then you'll see Astro Tracer, and then select Type 3. If you don't see Type 3, it means you have not updated the firmware or you do not own a Pentax K-3 III. Nice try. So after you select that, you then change the setting to bulb mode. Pentax makes a note here that it won't actually shoot in bulb mode, like where it'll just go indefinitely until you hit the shutter again or the cable release, but it's actually shooting in like a timed exposure mode, like you would shoot in manual. You select the time and then it takes the picture. Then it says to do your focusing and your composing. I focus using one of these Batonov masks, Batonov. Basically, it's a really ingenious, simple thing that I 3D printed. You can buy them for really cheap or 3D print them for free if you have a 3D printer. And this allows you to focus on stars. So focus and compose your shot and then take the shot, and they recommend using a cable release or remote control so you don't shake the camera. I didn't use either of those. I just used 12-second timer mode, but you could use one of those as well. And that is it. Maybe that sounded like a lot of steps, but basically turn it on, point it at the sky, take a picture. There's no other fiddling you have to do. The camera is going to do the work to make sure that there's no star trails. And using it myself, I was amazed how simple it was. I actually forgot to look up the directions of how to do it before I went out. So I was just figuring it out on the spot, and I was like, oh, okay, there's Astro Tracer. I guess go to type 3, turn it on, probably bulb mode because that's how the GPS mode worked. And I went there, and then I was just fiddling and did it. And my first shot looked awesome. I was so excited. So then I just started dialing in the exposure settings to get what I wanted. And that's where you get this picture here after about 30 minutes of playing around. So I'm a huge fan of this feature. I think Pentax really nailed it. There are some big advantages to this being built into the camera, even over the GPS version, and then certainly over cameras that can't do this at all. And there's also some disadvantages. So let's talk about those now. So the advantages, there's no additional equipment needed to shoot deep sky objects or whatever, wide field objects, whatever actual astrophotographers call things like the Orion's Nebula. There's no extra equipment needed. So you don't need a tracking mount. This is a small tracking mount. They get much bigger than this and much more expensive than that. The GPS Astro Tracer also didn't need additional equipment if your camera happened to have the GPS built in, which was only on a few Pentax cameras. The other Pentax cameras, you had to buy an optional GPS accessory that attached to the hot shoe of your camera. That was still a pretty good deal because it's small, light, and relatively inexpensive and gave you that feature. But this is great because it's just built into the camera and you don't need anything else. And you don't need to set it up. The GPS version required you to tune it every time you went to a new location. You don't have to do that with this. Like I said, it's really easy to use. You just turn the setting on, go into the right mode, bulb mode, point the camera at the sky, and take the picture. And this is pretty cool because there's a lot to remember when it comes to astrophotography. I'm not very good at it and I'm constantly forgetting something. So having less to think about is awesome. Very easy to use. And then finally, the results are great. I don't know what exactly I was expecting, but I thought maybe it would be a little gimmicky and I wouldn't get as long of exposure as I ended up getting. As you can see with this image I got, I really liked how it turned out. It ended up being a 40-second exposure at 300 millimeters on an APS-C camera. I thought I wasn't going to be able to get that much. And in fact, I was able to get more. I was able to get over a minute without any blur, but I had to bring it down for other reasons. You'll hear about that in the disadvantages later. But the results are great. If this was a little gimmicky and it just didn't really work that well or work consistently, then I would say it's kind of a failure, but that's not the case. It works really good and it gives you great results. Pinpoint stars. Awesome job. However, there are some disadvantages to using the Astro Tracer Type 3 over, say, the GPS version of Astro Tracer or a typical mount like this. So one disadvantage is it can only take pictures of stars and nothing can be in the foreground. If something's in the foreground, it'll throw off the preliminary processing and it won't be able to figure out how the stars are moving correctly. With the GPS Astro Tracer or using a traditional mount, that didn't matter. You could point it anywhere in the sky. There could be stuff in the foreground. You could compose a landscape, nightscape shot with the Milky Way in the background, and your camera didn't care. It would just track the stars and do it anyway. With this, you can't do that. And that makes it hard for those shots where you'd want to maybe take one shot for the foreground and then one shot with tracking the Milky Way, and the foreground gets blurry, but then you merge the layers in Photoshop and end up with a nice composition that way. But you can't do that with this. It's really only just for stars. Another disadvantage is that it takes a long time. So setting up is quick and easy, but with the GPS version, at least when you set it up and it was working right, it would work all night as long as you weren't moving around crazy distances. It would work. With this, the camera doesn't know that you're still pointing in the right direction. You could have moved the camera to a different direction every time. So for every shot you take, it takes those preliminary shots, and that can really add up. It makes it hard in two ways. One, your objects move out of the frame. So with a long lens like this, Orion's Nebula in 2 shots was out of the frame because each shot was taking so long with the processing included. So that would make it hard to stack because you're constantly having to recompose the shot and then take it, recompose, take it. And then the other reason it would make it hard to stack is that if you only have an hour or an hour and a half that you're out that night, it really limits the number of shots you're able to take. And at first you're going to think, oh, I got 40 seconds exposures, I can take X number of images. Well, really you're going to have to half that amount or even less than half that amount because of all this processing time included. And then the final disadvantage to it is it's actually less of a disadvantage and actually more of just kind of like something fiddly about it, maybe that doesn't work super great, is the exposure. So let's go back to the manual for a second. They have this precaution section that says you can get blurry images based on poor preliminary shooting. But I would add not only that, you can actually just totally fail the preliminary shooting. And when that happens, something pops up on the screen that says the processing failed or something like that. And then you just have to start over. And if you look here in the manual, it's saying that this can happen if there's ground scenery or clouds, or the stars are not sufficiently bright due to light pollution. So I was in an area that was pretty dark, and I was pointed away from any major city. So light pollution was not the problem. The problem that I got when it would fail was that my exposure was too low. I was hoping to be able to use the tracing longer and then lower the ISO. But instead, I was stuck around 1600 ISO as the lowest I could go with f4 on this 300mm lens, because when I went lower than that and tried to bump the shutter speed to a little bit longer, it would fail the processing. And my guess is that when it took those preliminary shots, the preliminary shots were not bright enough for it to detect the star's movements. And so that limits your exposure ability that much. With the other methods, you could shoot the night sky however you want. Do the stars appear or not? Are they very bright or only kind of bright? It doesn't matter. It'll take the shot for you. In this case, it seemed like they had to be bright, which in the case of Orion's Nebula and some other objects might be problematic with exposure issues. Like in my case, I blew out the highlights. So I'm going to keep playing with it, and I think as a photographer, there's some things I can do to adjust and compensate for that. Okay, as you can tell, I am a fan of Pentax Astrotracer Type 3. I think it works really well, and I'm excited to use it on more celestial objects. But there are some things that I think Pentax could add in their next iteration of this. They could include it with it, or maybe an Astrotracer Type 4 kind of scenario. So I have two improvements that they can make to the existing Astrotracer, and then I have one kind of stretch goal that they could go for that would be really awesome. So some improvements they could make. One, I think it'd be cool if you could somehow tell the camera that you're still pointed exactly the same direction. You haven't moved. Use whatever calibration you used before on the last frame and use it for the remaining frames until I tell you. And this would allow you to do that initial couple minutes of exposure processing, preliminary shooting as the manual calls it, and then be done for the night if you're only shooting the same object and you're pointed in the same area of the sky. Or at least be able to do it for less shots. Maybe every 5 shots you're going to do it again because you're having to recompose the shot. But just to manually change that would be cool. The second idea I have for an improvement would have to do with the exposure problem I was talking about. And it would be that the preliminary shots could be at a higher exposure than the actual final image, if that makes sense. So it could take the preliminary shots at a higher ISO to make sure it can see the stars and know which movement it needs to be. But then it could take the final image at whatever settings you put at. And that would eliminate the issue where you're a little bit constrained about what the exposure your final image is. And then the third thing I have is less of an improvement and more of a totally new feature, something really cool that I think Pentax could do with this new system. And that is to do stacking in the camera itself. So while I was out taking pictures of the Orion's Nebula with the camera and I was waiting for those long preliminary shots to complete, those 6 to 7 minute exposures, I busted out my Google Pixel smartphone. Now Google Pixel and I think the iPhones too have a feature where you can set it up on a tripod and take longer star pictures, a mode specifically meant for stars. And what it does is it doesn't just take one long exposure, it takes several short exposures and then stacks those not only to brighten the scene, but even to eliminate noise and to get greater detail. And it does all this for you in the camera. So at the end of this, I get one image and it's done all the stacking for me in the camera. And it looks awesome. Actually, I was pleasantly surprised. And I think it's fun enough to use that I think if you own one of these types of phones, you should go out and try it just because of how fun it is to kind of set up and just focus on composition, worry less about the technical parts of how to reduce noise and stack hundreds of images and whatever else. And so it'd be cool if there's some sort of intelligent stacking. So combined with this feature, and you could set the camera up, have it shoot, every now and then recompose, and then at the end it gives you a stacked image. And maybe it gives you all the individual images as well. Obviously, it's got to be a feature that you turn on because not every photographer wants that. You're going to get better results probably by doing that all yourself. But for a novice like me, that would be pretty cool. There are my thoughts on Pentax Astrotracer Type 3. I'm a huge fan, pleasantly surprised at how well it works, how easy it is to use, and I'm excited to use it on other celestial objects in the sky. Let me know if you want to see more about it. Let me know if you have any questions about it. Leave those down in the comments below. Remember to go out there and shoot with whatever camera you have now, even if it's not the Pentax K-3 Mark III with Astrotracer Type 3. Sorry, this is not available to other cameras right now. That's a little bit of a bummer. I wish they had released it to some of the older cameras. But regardless, go out and shoot with whatever camera you have, whatever you find fun to shoot, and take some wonderful pictures. Until next time, happy snapping.